Croeso, welcome back everyone to our final session of the first day of Cymorth Cymru's online annual conference focused on transforming homelessness. A big thank you to everyone who's joined us throughout the day. I think we've had some really engaging sessions. And thanks for those of you who were bearing with us in the last session as we tried to overcome some technical issues, and apologies you had to hear me rambling on for quite a long time during that. You'll be pleased to know that I won't be talking for too long in this session because we've got some fantastic speakers who are going to talk about new approaches to homelessness. We know from the pandemic that a challenge was set down by the Minister to think about transforming homelessness services off the back of the pandemic, and the phase 2 funding was put in place to help us to do that. I'm really delighted that we're going to be hearing from both Crisis South Wales and Platfform today about some new approaches that they've taken within their services. They're going to share some of the learning, some of the opportunities, but also some of the challenges that they've faced. And we hope that this will be really interesting and informative for all the people who are here with us today. So as promised, I'm going to shut up now and I'll hand over first of all to Ashella Lewis and Stuart Mander, who have joined us from Crisis South Wales, and they're going to talk about the critical time interventions model that they're trialling in South Wales. Thanks very much.
Are we okay to have our slides? Yeah, brilliant. Fab. Hi, so I'm Ashella. I'm the progression manager in the Crisis Skylight in South Wales. And fun fact, I started with Crisis on the day of lockdown last year. So it's been an interesting induction to Crisis, and it's been really good. One of the plans pre-pandemic was to start this critical time intervention pilot, and COVID-19's put a bit of a delay on that, inevitable delay. But I wanted to just give a really brief overview of critical time intervention, and then Stuart's going to talk to you about how it's impacted his team, because he's the team leader, and all the plans that we put in place in order to try and start the pilot. Next slide, please. Thank you. So yes, I'm going to really quickly cover what is critical time intervention, a little bit about the history, the evidence for the model, look at the key principles of it, and then Stuart's going to cover the impact that COVID-19 has had on the pilot, the phase 2 work that him and his team have been doing, and the preparations that we'll be doing for the pilot alongside that phase 2 work. And at this point, I have to thank the best practice team at Crisis for supporting us in prepping for the pilot and for this presentation today, because obviously we haven't been delivering the model during this period of time, but lots of plans are in place to do so. Next slide, please. Thanks. So CTI in a nutshell. CTI was designed to break the vicious cycle between institutionalisation and homelessness, and to promote stable community living by providing people with mental illness with emotional and practical support, and strengthening their long-term ties to their community during transitions from institutional to community living. So that differs from our current service offer at the moment, as critical time intervention operates within a defined timescale with distinct phases over a 9-month period. And it also involves a substantial pre-engagement phase as well, which I'll go through with you. Whereas our current Skylight offer emphasises working at the client's own pace of change. So this is a different model for service delivery for us. Critical time intervention is part of the housing-led approach to preventing and ending homelessness, and it's often located within the prevention part of the spectrum of interventions. So it's looking fundamentally to bridge the gap between and provide continuity of care between institution and the community. So in our case, we're going to be working with prison leavers from Swansea Prison, and there's also another pilot that is in the planning at the same time as ours with Crisis for Merseyside, and they're going to be working with prison leavers there as well. So it's looking to bridge that gap between the institution and the community, and it's really important for the CTI workers, for Stuart and his team, to get to know the individual before they're released from prison, and that's essential for the model to work really. So it's really clearly time limited from the outset, And the emphasis is on the individual drawing upon their own resources and building those community links, whether that be with professionals or whether that be with informal community links such as their family. So the main focus is on assisting people to make those links and maintaining those links. So the model is sort of intensive at the start, and then that decreases as we move along. And the support is focused upon 3 areas identified with the member as being most important to them in sustaining their accommodation. And we make maps of these social and professional networks. So the history of the model, there's been not a lot of examples of the model being used, but it started in the United States, where during the late 1980s and 90s, there were large shelters operating in New York City for those with severe ill mental health. And you can see the picture there of the Armory in New York City, and you can see the number of people using those shelters. And what happened was, in 1990, there was an increase in permanent supportive housing, an increase in mental health services. So people were being moved out of those shelters, but for some reason, they weren't able to sustain that housing, and they were coming back into the shelters. And that's where the CTI developed, with a focus on that continuity of care from the shelter into the community. It's important to know it's about that transition, and transitions are really tricky, especially when they're coming out into really fragmented systems, and if they have poor health, physical and mental health. So that transition is really tricky. Next slide, please. So these are two studies from America relating to critical time intervention, to show sort of the evidence as to why we're trying to pilot the model here, to see the impact it will have on the people we work with. So the first one was critical time intervention for men leaving a shelter-based program in New York City in 1997. So you can see there that the effects of CTI after 18 months were looked at, and there was a 67% reduction in homeless nights for those individuals that accessed CTI rather than those who didn't. So an average of 30 nights for the critical time intervention group versus 91 nights for the control group who didn't work within the critical time intervention model. So 8.3% of the critical time intervention group were homeless versus 22.9% of the control group. So that's a significant difference. The second one is for critical time intervention model for adults leaving hospital to community in 2007. So, and the result of this was that the prevalence of homelessness among participants receiving critical time intervention was 5 times lower than among those receiving the usual care. And also it was associated with a significantly reduced risk of rehospitalization. And you can find more about the evidence on the Critical Time website. There have been some UK studies as well. There was one for Fulfilling Lives in Newcastle. There is a current trial with HMP Lincoln that I know the team have been in touch with, but that is a shorter model of 6 weeks resettlement sort of support. And also Crisis are supporting ACH in Bristol through their innovation grant, looking at refugees and supporting them into the community as well. So there's quite a lot of different pilots of the model to see what the impact is, and we're really excited to be able to trial the model and evaluate the impact on the people we work with. Next slide, please. So here you can see a bit more clearer what I was saying about the model and the 9 months sort of really defined interventions. So you have the pre-CTI engagement phase, which is all about that with the CTI team building relationships with those individuals, understanding their needs, identifying their focus and what support and what links they will need in the community. And it's really important that in one of those studies, 3 or more contacts in this pre-CTI phase almost doubled the effect of critical time intervention. So that phase is really important to us. The next phase then is the transition itself. And that first 3 months then is a really intense period of work, forming those links, building those relationships with that support network and deciding on the area of focus for each person to work with. Then you have the tryout phase, which is the next 3 months, which is a little bit of sort of testing out those links, troubleshooting, identifying problem-solving skills, and so forth. But it's that testing phase. And then in the last 3 months, you're looking at transferring that care into those supporting links in the community, stepping away, reducing support, so that at 9 months, it will be the community support that takes over for that individual. Next slide. So a little bit of a summary, because it is a different model, but so it's designed around the transition, community-based, is linking, not doing, linking to long-term support. There's harm reduction. It's got a limited focus of up to those 3 goals that I said that, you know, someone thinks will enable them to sustain their accommodation, trying to minimise early discharges, ideally no early discharges from the model. The CTI workers having small caseloads, there being a decrease in intensity as you move along that 9-month period of the model. The team having frequent case reviews, and there being team-based supervision as well. So those are all things that kind of identify this model. Next slide, please. So Stuart's going to talk to you now a little bit about the impact that COVID has had on our plans, and I'll pass over to him. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Stuart Mander, team leader for STI and Crisis. As you know, with COVID, whilst the CTI pilot has been delayed due to the COVID pandemic, the team have been working closely with the local authorities across both Dalton and Swansea, with people who have been placed in the temporary accommodation and phase 2 rapid rehousing. This has enabled us to use certain aspects of the CTI model, as Ashella's alluded to, within a setting, such as working closely with other support providers to ensure people access the right services at the right time, providing coaching to individuals or experiencing a transition in their lives, and more importantly, building relationships with people who may want to access the CTI model when it commences. Unfortunately, though, as we all had difficulties with COVID, it has had an impact on the following. It has been difficult to engage with some people due to difficulties around face-to-face meetings. I know in Crisis in South Wales here, we have used the Wellbeing Centre in Swansea for face-to-face appointments. But unfortunately, building some of those relationships with people has been challenging, something that is obviously key to the CTI model. What also has been difficult as well is, especially with those who experience significant trauma, to build the trust within the relationship due to the face-to-face contact being limited, has proved challenging. But we have done some work around this. So we have offered mobile phone provision to members to assist with them having contact with members and coaches. Data top-ups being provided to allow people to use Zoom to engage with services when they feel comfortable to do so, such as coffee mornings, art, budgeting and rent and ready courses. But it's also enabled Crisis to embrace a new approach to coaching and support, which will form an important part of future work with members, especially within CTI. There have also been some wider difficulties that have been encountered due to the pandemic, these being a slower turnover in stock within the local authorities and the RSLs, although it is starting to change and increase. Many of the community initiatives and groups of people to remain to access and remain temporarily suspended due to COVID, which again, you know, when you're building relationships is key to CTI. And it has again highlighted the ongoing issue, the lack of suitable housing and provision across the sector. If you could move the slide, please. So, pilot preparations, the more positive aspect. The pilot will be working, as Ashella said, with people who have a link between homelessness and offending. And despite the delay in the pilot, we continue to work with the partnership agencies in readiness for the CTI commencement, which will hopefully be towards the end of April. We have been working with the short-term sentence team, looking at people leaving custody with a sentence less than 12 months to identify referrals for CTI at an early stage. This will be the pre-CTI phase, which is important when building the relationships. However, we appreciate some people will maybe released short notice, so we've linked into the resettlement pathway, which includes housing options, Talbot, Swansea and St George's Trust. Looking at those who may benefit from the CTI model upon discharge from prison, so make sure they can have an element of support when they're released. We're also in regular contact with HMP Swansea regarding referrals, and we're currently using telephone conferencing to facilitate contact with current prisoners. However, fingers crossed, post-COVID world, we are looking at possible video link and face-to-face assessments to take place, and which is particularly important for the pre-CTI work. We have met with Pobl and we'll be closely working with them around move-on properties for those accessing CTI, and we are hoping that more RSLs get on board later on throughout the pilot. We're also actively engaging in ongoing discussions with the prisoner pathway around further innovative approaches to work in prison releases. and Crisis have taken the bold step to recruit into the landlord liaison officer post, which will identify and work closely with ourselves, private rented landlords, around increasing housing provision across the sector and for the CTI to potentially access. And as Ashella has already said earlier on, we have met with CTI Lincoln around best practice for the CTI to include in the pilot. If you move on to the next slide, please. Right, so, we recognise CTI isn't the most suitable intervention for all. For example, housing first models do exist for those who experience significant trauma and who may want a more intensive and open-ended support model. However, the CTI pilot provides Crisis an opportunity to test, as Ashella said, a more structured and focused approach, which is a strong evidence base. So we're using the following eligibility criteria. So we're looking at individuals over the age of 18, at a common agreement of choice, not mandate to participate. In other words, it's not going to be linked to any licence conditions, they're not forced to engage with us. The release must be into the local area, so Neath Botop or Swansea, which is where the pilot's covering, and have a local connection. Must have recourse to public funds, history of repeat offending, a history of repeat homelessness, mental health or substance use support needs, not housing first. As I've mentioned earlier on, this model doesn't suit those, but we will look around and work around that area and not MAPA 3 cases, mainly due to the fact they have a lot of agencies already involved with them. So you may be asking what we're hoping to achieve. So we are hoping to achieve an impact on the following: members accessing, sustaining suitable accommodation, accessing recovery support, supporting opportunities for change and growth, building appropriate nexus within the community for ongoing support. And as Ashella has already said earlier on in her presentation, is CTI coach has got a clear remit to link and not to do. So summing up here, we're now in the process of going around partnership agencies to present the CTI model in readiness for its commencement at the end of April. So if you do require any additional information regarding the CTI, please contact Ashella or I. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ashella and Stuart. That was really interesting to hear both the background behind CTI for people who are not familiar with the model, but also your plans for rolling it out, the work that you've been doing across multiple agencies in preparation for that. And I'm sure we'll be asking you back in the future to tell us how it's gone. I'm delighted that next up we have a familiar face, Oliver Townsend, who up until recently was Policy and External Affairs Manager at Cymorth, but has a new role at Platfform. And I'm really, really pleased he's here today to talk to us about the asset coaches model that Platfform have been rolling out over the past few months. So without much ado, I'll hand over to Ol.
Thanks, Katie. I'll just start talking until my slides appear, and then I'll start talking about interesting things. I think I feel a bit stitched up. I am the last person that you'll be hearing from today, so apologies. We'll get through it together as we used to anyway. I just wanted to start with this conversation really around all too often our services, whether you're in housing, homelessness, mental health or anywhere, can often feel like a factory conveyor belt. I've never been in a car factory, so I'll just assume that's a conveyor belt. What I mean by that is, particularly in terms of mental health services, all too often there is a prescriptive response and approach, which is to medicalise, to stigmatise and to diagnose issues around mental health, rather than actually looking at what people have in terms of their strengths, their ambitions and their ideas and dreams. And that is really what's at the core of the asset coach model. Next slide, please. So you probably all would have seen Mayday Trust on Twitter and elsewhere talking about what is called a person-led strengths-based transitional approach. So that is essentially what the asset coaches are. It's reflecting the PTS coaches within Platform. Person-led, obviously the clue is in the name, but it really goes beyond what we might traditionally understand in that context, and really focuses on, actually it's led very much by what the person wants. You know, we don't go by what a traditional service might suggest people need. We don't go by what we think they would find useful. We talk, we coach, we support, we listen, and eventually people will share what's really bothering them. On that basis as well, we're strengths-based, so very similar to some of the things we just saw from Crisis. We actually go to people and listen to what they're good at, what they want to do. And transitional for me is the key point about making sure that services are not the main focus for people all the time. The main purpose is to move people out of services to create independence, or as we often say, interdependence with communities, friends, family, if that's possible. The idea being that people's identity shouldn't be tied up in services or professionals. One of the most heartbreaking things you can see so often is when you ask people to look at the people around them in their life, and a lot of the time people's only support and only contact and only relationships are professional ones. And that's amazing, because it means our services across Wales are there where people need them most. But actually, if we're entirely honest, we need to be reimagining our services to make sure that people are being supported to build their own contacts and their own lives. Next slide, please. So excuse the coach-related pun. So our asset coaches, we've talked a lot already, similar to some of the CTI ideals that you'd heard about just before. We want to take a PTS approach, which is largely a coaching approach. We listen, we support with various coaching models. But the key thing for me is that our asset coaches have to be champions for change. There is no point just offering a service which becomes another service in a broken system. So all of our asset coaches were recruited on the idea that they would be activists. That's not to say that they would all act in the same way and that they'd all be chaining themselves to the Senedd or any of those kind of traditional things you might think of as activists. What we mean by that is people who are not afraid to challenge, who are not afraid to take those opportunities to really hold a lens up or a mirror up to what we do within or outside our organisations as well. So I know that some of you will be thinking, well, those are quite warm, woolly words, and it's what I call the yeah and or the yeah but question. So what does that actually mean day to day in terms of what we're changing? Well, I'll go on to some of that in particular, but for us, it's meant already after only 3 to 4 months of having asset coaches in place, we've looked at redoing our referrals process. We've used our asset coaches to develop new training approaches. We've started to consider how we assess people as they enter platform services. We've looked at routes for challenge within the organisation and for feedback, and there's still more to come. So next slide, please. Thank you. So we split our challenging the system, which is the key part of the asset coaches, into 4 main areas: practice, procedure, partnership and policy, which is just a nice way of describing it. If we go to the next slide quickly, you'll see that practice, this is the area where we've really focused on mainly in the last 3 months. So in terms of frontline practice, what does an asset coach need to do? So trauma-informed, that's a given, but not just in terms of having ticked a box and gone on a training, but in terms of actually living and breathing it. Asset-based, you can't be asset-based unless you're trauma-informed, and you can't be trauma-informed unless you're asset-based, so the two go hand in hand. And we've really developed training around coaching techniques, so things like the TGRO model, motivational interviewing and more. In terms of the frontline support, we've made sure that we've got support for coaches. So we have reflective sessions every week. They have a WhatsApp group without a manager in, where they can actually talk about some of their concerns or challenges. And we've opened up a safe space and a line of communication. So in that sense, myself as the head of partnerships and practice, I don't line manage any of them or anyone in the kind of lines of reporting. So they've got a safe space and a line of communication to me. In terms of leadership, we've really had to model how to have difficult conversations with people. Again, being trauma-informed, making sure that it's non-hierarchical. So in those sessions of reflective sessions, I've made sure that we're committed to learning together. So I've been on training with people, and critically, as their sort of supporting kind of manager along with 2 other heads of service, I've really followed a tradition of saying I'll do it, and then I'll say I've done it. And what that means is that any kind of initial worries that they might have as asset coaches, because they're trying something new, they're trying to fit into a slightly different old system, they know that they can trust myself and the other 2 heads of service when we say that we'll try and make changes. We've offered PTS courses. and also that we've got a clear structure for support. So by that I mean that a lot of the time the asset coaches will be working directly with people with quite significant challenges that they're facing, and the whole idea of becoming an asset coach and working in this way is to listen to people where they are at in that moment, to not always try and move them on. It means sometimes sitting with a lot of discomfort and worry and uncertainty as practitioners. So we need to make sure that we support and listen to our coaches as well. We've got really strong organisational buy-in from our Director of Operations, from our Chief Executive, and from the rest of the transformation team. But in addition, the asset coaches have got 3 senior managers, 2 operational managers and myself. We currently have 8 asset coaches from across Swansea, Merthyr, Caerphilly, Torfaen, as well as a pilot with Rhondda Housing Association. So it's quite a small team, but it's very perfectly formed. And I wanted to just take this opportunity to actually pay tribute to the work that they've done. They're some of the most empathetic, hardworking, wonderful coaches and people that I've worked with. So I just wanted to pay tribute to the work that they've done. Next slide, please. So procedures, we've kind of talked about this already, kind of over the course of kind of our time at Asset Coach in Platform, but we've realised, it shouldn't be much of a surprise for us, that so many of our referrals are deficit based. So at the same time, there's too much information and too little. And by that, I mean that there's so much information about what could go wrong, what issues people have, what their diagnosis is, things that have happened to them, things that they struggle with, things that we should be scared of or worried about. You know, and actually not enough about what you're good at, what do you enjoy doing, you know, where do you like to go for walks, do you want to go for walks or do you want to stay in the house? You know, all of those questions that you sort of take for granted as a person who's not someone who's a service user. So that's one of the things that we're really trying to work on at the moment, is to really redo and revamp our referrals to be much more strengths-based. At the moment, our referrals are also based on our aims, not other people's. So we need to make sure we get better at that. At the moment, in terms of assessment, every question or interaction reinforces the us versus them approach. It's very risk assessment. And it's, like I said in the earlier section, it's based on goals and outcomes that they have no control over. We've already learned a lot from recruitment of asset coaches. So we really grappled with how to recruit for values, not for knowledge. And on this, I drew on a lot of the work that Liverpool City region did around Housing First. So what qualifies as a good or a skilled support worker or employee? You know, and our view is that you can recruit for values, but you can train for knowledge, which is something that I know people are very aware of across the sector. One of the biggest things we did actually when we were recruiting for the asset coaches was took a very generous approach towards some of the application forms. And we decided that even if someone had done a very basic application form, but we felt that there was something in it, we made sure we had a phone call with them prior to the interview, almost instead of that application form. And that meant that we actually interviewed 2 or 3 people who are now asset coaches who we would otherwise not have had. So that's really a big challenge for us within Platform, but probably across the sector, is to make sure that we're not missing these amazing, empathetic, instinctive support workers and professionals who bring amazing experience and knowledge, but who maybe struggle to do an application form. Something really simple that's basically locking in the traditional way we work in services. And again, reflective practice, so creating that safe space, making sure that our asset coaches feel equal, feel important, making sure it's a regular and reliable time so people know that it's important, and encouraging openness. So I tend to chair those meetings with Liz Ostrowski, our other head of service, and we're really open there about things we're struggling with, and we try as much as it's possible not to feel like a manager and other workers. Next slide, please. And then partnership and policy, those are the other 2 areas. So we're still learning on that. But the idea is that the more our asset coaches work with people, we will start to understand what the structural barriers are within Platform, what the barriers are across Wales, and sometimes maybe the ways that local authorities, government work that maybe aren't that helpful. The big one for us at the moment is the mental health system, which at the moment is broken, it's traumatizing, and it doesn't work. And so one of the huge things that our asset coaches are going to have to grapple with is how to provide that support within a fundamentally flawed system. And that final reminder really that asset coaches are champions for change, and that's the main focus for them. Next slide, please. Brill. So that's a very whistle-stop tour. Keep as close to time as possible, now or email.
Thanks very much, all. You went slightly
just that final dot, I think, but yeah.
I think your internet has slightly failed you at the end, but we had the vast majority of that presentation absolutely perfectly. So thank you very much. Lots to consider, and I think really helpfully broken down in terms of those the different P's that you listed. Very, very lucky that they all began with P, all fit into the nice alliteration there that you've got. Not sure if that was planned or not, but that was really brilliant, hearing from two, different models, but I think lots of commonalities actually in terms of approaches and putting people at the centre, being trauma informed, being compassionate, being empathetic. So I really loved hearing from that. So thank you very much indeed. We have a couple of questions. Reminder that you can submit questions through the Hoover platform. We'll keep an eye on those and try and make sure that we include as many as possible. So the first question for all of you is, how have other organisations, whether that be partners or stakeholders, responded to the ideas of these new approaches, new services? Have they embraced that change? Have they been on a journey? Have you had to convince some people? And how are those partnerships and relationships at the moment? Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to say that obviously Stuart has been sort of liaising with a lot of partner organisations, and they've all been really keen so far, really keen to learn about the model, really keen to be involved and learn more about it. So it's been really positive so far. I don't know, Stuart, if you want to add anything to that, but so far it's been really positive.
Yeah, it has been positive feedback from a lot of people. I previously worked in the sector before with ex-offenders, even custody, when I was a homelessness caseworker. And I think this approach does put the individual first. I think it's a really good way of working. So I work closely with Housing Options and Swansea Prison on board as well. It's just hopefully get more RSLs involved as further down the line. That's the main aim, I think.
Great, and they've been willing to kind of invite you into some of those transitional meetings, with the prison and probation, and they've kind of embraced that with open arms. Maybe viewed it as an additional asset to help them achieve what they want to achieve.
Yeah, I think it's commonly known, commonly thought really that the current service provision, the way it works at the moment, hasn't worked properly or the way it should have. So I think anyone that looks at a different way of approaching things and has different outcomes will be embraced by all. So I think that's the sort of feedback we've had really.
Great. And all, your asset coaches are working across a large number of local authorities and within a housing association. Has there been a positive response to that change in approach? And particularly if the asset coaches have had to provide some of that challenge so far to some of those broken systems, how has that gone down and how have people responded to that in other organisations?
Yeah, so I think we have to be completely honest from the beginning, and that's where we want to be. Most of the challenge has been internal at the moment.
Sorry, all. I think your internet connection is letting you down. Do you want to maybe try turning the camera off?
Is that any better? Can you hear me now?
Yep, can hear you. Great.
I don't know what's happening, but at least you got the presentation. Yeah, most of the challenge has actually been internal, and that's really positive because there's no point us coming today and saying, oh, everything's perfect and we're amazing, because actually the whole point of asset coaches is that we really challenge ourselves. And that's what I've encouraged the asset coaches to do is, we need to look to our own services first. I think the local authorities are finding it positive. We've had 2 quite short-term pilots renewed for another year through phase 2. So I think they definitely are starting to see a value. It's very, very early. The kind of stress of COVID is kind of resolved, is have a commissioner group of all the people who are commissioning asset coaches so that we can have a forum to share some of that challenge.
Sorry, all your internet connection's not great, I'm afraid. You keep dipping in and dip out. Maybe we'll come back to you in a minute if we maybe just look at another question. So what have the challenges been, Ashella and Stuart, if you could kick us off around implementing a new model? I guess not everyone who is part of the team will have been familiar with the CTI model before. Maybe they've had to look at different approaches, different ways of working, and how have you managed that kind of internally and managed to kind of get people on board and embracing this new model going forward?
So it's been a new model for myself as well to get to grips with. So, we've done a lot of reading, we've been on training with Homeless Link. The best practice team have been sort of, training us as well and speaking to us about it. So it's about that, looking at the ways that the model is distinctive in that it is linking, not doing. And much like Oliver was saying, it's about looking at the strengths and the assets of the individual and where their community links and support is going to be. Because as I said, it shouldn't be a professional, that shouldn't be your go-to support network. Ideally, it would be in the community. So it's about changing our mindset, really, if you've come from a support background, into that linking and not doing. And a lot of the preparation work as well, and focusing on that pre-engagement, which I guess you don't get a lot of, really. There isn't, in our kind of work, usually it's quite reactionary when people come to you with a problem, and you provide that support. So it's been a bit of a change of mindset. But Stuart, I don't know if you want to add, as the team leader, managing the team, if there's anything that's cropped up.
No, I think we're all quite new to the approach, so I think everyone's really keen to get involved and try something different. I think there have been issues in terms of COVID in general. I think Ashella mentioned she started in the beginning of lockdown. I started smack bang in the middle of lockdown, so it's difficult when you're trying to embed a new pilot when you haven't met any of your team properly. So I think everyone's experienced the same things like that. But yeah, it's good. I think there's some things to work around. To be honest, in terms of prison service, can't do face-to-face contact, which is key to pre-CTI. But it's all a learning. It's all a pilot. We're trying different things. We'll see how they work. We'll review it. Really optimistic and really enthusiastic about it. But it's starting really. Roll on end of April. That's what I say.
Absolutely. I don't know if you're still managing to be with us, whether you wanted to add anything to what you were saying before about rolling it out, and whether that's internal reflections or from external partners.
Yeah, sorry about that. It's the perils of having 2 people trying to use the same Wi-Fi. So it's happening again, isn't it? Anyway, I'll power through. Yeah, one of the things that we're really keen on is working with commissioners to try and create a kind of group of commissioners of asset coaching, so that any of the challenge that does come eventually through the work that we're doing isn't seen as really adversarial. Because one of the things that we can get really quite protective about, I think, as a sector, both mental health and housing, because we all know each other, don't we? Sometimes challenge can feel quite difficult and painful. So actually what I'm trying to do before that even comes up is say to commissioners, this will come through, but it's meant in a really positive way about how we can make changes and differences for people using services. So that's one of the things we've got in the pipeline, really, is making sure that they've got a space to really understand and respond to any of those things, because we're all in it. Every single one of us is in this kind of profession to make a difference for people, whether that's commissioner, government, local, anyone. We're all here. So what I'm hoping is that will pull some of the pain out of that challenge. But yeah, at the moment, as I was saying, most of it is internal about how we can improve things we do. And that's one of the reasons I was really keen to talk today, is to kind of say, you know, we're here as Platform to say this is one idea we've got. It's not the only idea. It's not the only game in town, but actually what we are doing is really using it to really challenge ourselves. And I just invite other people to be part of that challenge as well.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point, because there's also that issue of kind of having some empathy for commissioners who may well want to see change happen themselves, but are facing significant pressures from above or within to commission services in certain ways, or to to set out the approach in a particular way. And we know many of these people who are absolutely in this for the right reasons and want to make change happen. But I think that's where the third sector can often trial models such as CTI or our asset coaches, because we have the flexibility, the fleet of foot to be able to try new things, whereas it's really difficult within a huge local authority to completely change how things are done. And so actually that partnership, working with local authorities, working in partnership with the third sector to trial some new ways of working and to get learning, as you said, not just for one partner but for all partners to embrace that learning, I think is really, really important. Question in, have there been significant changes to the model? So PTS model has been around for a few years through the Mayday Trust. Is there anything that you've done distinctively with the asset coaches model here in Wales, or that might differ a bit or build on the learning from the PTS model?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the key difference is we're a mental health charity first and foremost, and I think the majority of what Mayday Trust does is around homelessness. Now, obviously, there's clear links because the work that we're doing is housing related support, so there's similarities. But I think in Wales particularly, the work that has happened around making homelessness as a system more compassionate, more trauma-informed, more preventative, which I know Cymorth has been involved with from the beginning. I think that's been something that hasn't been replicated in the same way across mental health. And I don't mean in terms of the third sector mental health. I mean that diagnosis-led, that very deficit-based approach within mental health services. And I remember being at a Cymorth conference years ago when we saw about the link between borderline personality disorder and the trauma that women survivors face. And that for me has really brought home those impacts of kind of the deficit-based medicalised approaches. So I think that's where we have to be different within asset coaches, within Platform, because we're not just there to talk about housing, we're there to actually listen. And so we've had to be very sensitive to that. So that's the main change. But also I think for me, it's about re-envisioning that, reimagining that challenge idea. So that challenge is kind. Challenge is really forthright and honest, but it is kind, and it's about putting people at the heart of what we do. And I think that is definitely the principle that's shared with Mayday. But I think sometimes people hear the phrase activist and they do think about, railings and chains and chanting and shouting. And I suppose one of the things I really wanted to get through to people today is that you can challenge a system and you can really hold up a mirror to, practice that can be improved without necessarily shouting really loud about it. And that's what I hope our asset coaches will do as well. Thanks
all. Yeah, you know me, I love a bit of shouting and getting furious and occupying and protesting, but you're right. There are different tools in your toolkit that you have to use to affect change, and it's about knowing to use the right ones in the right circumstances, and building those strong relationships with people to affect change can often be much more effective than chaining yourself to a building, as much as I love that activism. We've got one more final question before we finish today. Are there any plans to formally share the changes made to the recruitment process at Platform? And more generally, are there any plans to kind of share the outcomes, I guess, as I imagine you'll be evaluating both the CTI project and the asset coaches, and what might the timelines be for that? Old, do you want to go first, specifically about changes made to the recruitment process and more generally about the asset coach approach?
Yeah, so I need to clarify, they're not official changes to the recruitment process as a whole yet. This was very specifically around the recruitment of asset coaching, because what it does, because you've got a specific cohort of people, it allows you to try new things in a safe way, and it's a pilot, so you can kind of push the boundaries a bit. But I know that's something that we want to look into more at Platform. And once we've done that, I'd be really happy to share it and kind of work with any other organisations really to look at that. In terms of evaluation, yeah, we plan on doing that. And as soon as we've got that out after a year of running it, we'll publish that for everyone across the sector.
Brilliant, thanks very much all. And Ashella and Stuart, are there plans to kind of publish any evaluation from the CTI at some point in the future?
So the pilot starts at the end of April, as Stuart has alluded to. He's very keen to get started with all this and preparation and delays. And it's a 2-year pilot that we're doing. So obviously there will be some time period after that to evaluate. And it's really interesting that, you know, when we're discussing the planning and preparation, we're talking about, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? We can't do this, all these barriers and things, but they will form part of the evaluation. You know, if we can't access suitable properties, if we can't access the number of them for the people we work with, that will form part of the evaluation that something is flawed in the system. You know, if there are things that crop up that impact the model, they will form part of the evaluation, and that we can feedback about what needs to work on. Like Oliver was saying, mental health is a big issue that we've encountered through the phase 2 work that Stuart's been doing as well, and how that is flawed, the services that are in place. So all of these things will impact on the evaluation, yeah, and I'm sure the best practice team will be happy to share what comes out of that.
Brilliant, and we'll be very happy to support that sharing of that information and facilitate that. So please do bear us in mind if you'd like some help getting that out to the wider sector. I'd like to say a massive thank you to our panel today. It was really interesting. I'm sure that lots of people have taken away lots of food for thought about new approaches, how they can make changes within their own organisations. And I'm sure everyone's very keen to hear how the asset coaches and the CTI pilot goes in the future. So thank you so much to Ashella, to Stuart and to all for coming along today and being part of our conference. I hope everyone enjoyed the session. Diolch yn fawr iawn. So we're at the end of our conference day today, our first day of our first ever online annual conference. There's obviously been a couple of technical hitches, but big thanks to the team at Cymorth for helping us to overcome those and deliver a full day of programme. So we've heard from the Minister this morning, setting out her vision for ending homelessness in Wales. We've heard from John Sparks, who chaired the Homelessness Action Group, about how important it is to turn those recommendations into action over the coming months and years. We had a really interesting discussion about the route to rapid rehousing, hearing from Shelter Cymru, from Pembrokeshire County Council and Cadwyn Housing Association about the challenges and the opportunities as we start to move forward the conversation about rapid rehousing in Wales. We also had a brilliant lunchtime event about psychologically informed approaches, where we heard from Viv Mumby, one of our path trainers, and heard from a number of people working in the sector about their experiences and reflections of PI. We heard from Rob Roth from the National Lottery Community Fund about their Helping End Homelessness Fund, and I'll be keeping a keen eye out to see which of those projects are successful, and we hope that many of you are involved in those. We heard from Graham and Ed from the North Wales Harm Reduction Service about the change that they're making, working across substance misuse, mental health and the homelessness sector up in North Wales, and also from Tracy from Welsh Government, who talked about the strategic commitment to better integration between those policy areas. And our last session today, our new approaches to ending homelessness. We hope that you've had a really fantastic first day. I've certainly enjoyed the discussion, the debate and the questions, and a huge thank you to all of our speakers today, to our day sponsor, the National Lottery Community Fund, and our main conference sponsors, Clwyd Allen and Digital Communities Wales. We hope to see many of you back here tomorrow. We've got another fun-packed day focused on learning from the response to COVID. Again, sponsored by Clwyd Allen and Digital Communities Wales as our main sponsors. And our day sponsor for tomorrow is Cadwyn Housing Association. We'll hear from Pete Mackey, who will talk about the research about different approaches to homelessness across Great Britain during COVID-19 and how the response differed in England, Scotland and Wales. We'll also have a session on leadership reflections during a crisis, where we'll hear from Claire Budden, Chief Exec at Clwyd Allen, and Lindsay Cordry-Bruce, Chief Exec at the Woolwich. We'll have another free frontline worker event focused on frontline worker experiences, where we'll hear from Gareth, our research officer, who leads the frontline network work in Wales. We'll have a session on embedding digital support. We've already heard lots about how digital has helped us to stay in touch with people and maintain support during the pandemic. And we'll hear from Digital Communities Wales, Innovate Trust and Llamau about the ways that they've been supporting people during this pandemic. And we'll finish off tomorrow with a panel discussion about no recourse to public funds. We know that during this pandemic, we've been able to provide housing and support with people with no recourse to public funds. But the big challenge is what we do once this pandemic is over and how we make sure those solutions are in place. So I hope to see many of you again tomorrow. I hope you had a good first day, and thank you very much to everyone who's contributed and made today a success. Have a lovely evening, or nos da.